I'll start with a question in the room.
Andrew Gray with CTV News. In the aftermath of Joyce Saskatchewan's death, do you think that broader systemic racism or broader systemic change is needed in the healthcare system to deal with systemic racism, not just in Quebec but across the country?
Absolutely. This is by no stretch of the imagination an isolated event. Right now, as the funeral for Joyce Saskatchewan takes place, there are many instances around Canada where this continues to occur, perhaps not in such an acute and disgusting fashion as it occurred last week, but it's systemic, it's system-wide. That includes, it isn't limited by any provincial borders or territorial borders. That is why it's why the issue was highlighted in the speech from the throne in terms of moving towards Indigenous healthcare, better serving Indigenous peoples. Obviously, these are acute instances of racism that need to be weeded out, but limiting it at that is not sufficient. There is a system that has failed and continues to fail Indigenous peoples. The healthcare system failed Joyce Saskatchewan and her family. I note today that Premier Legault apologized in the National Assembly for the failure of the Quebec public health system, but it is not limited to that. It is something occurring across Canada. We saw particular instances about 2 years ago with respect to transport of Inuit children from the north without their parents, and certain words of the health minister at the time with respect to those parents, which were perhaps lost in translation, but are a small insight into the scale of the problem. Imagine when you were at your most vulnerable and particularly very young, going into a healthcare system that is entirely foreign to you and not being able to speak your mother tongue or being misunderstood. Joyce Saskatchewan was speaking Atikamekw and was misunderstood. So that's an element. And that is something that has its evidence in the video. But it was also highlighted in the Vienna report, which contains pages and pages based on testimony after testimony of failure of the healthcare system. And so there is a role of the federal government. There is a role for all governments. There is a role for every Canadian in this to understand that and understand it better and to move forward.
Last week when we asked you about this, something you referenced was the fact that Indigenous communities tend to be fairly skeptical of healthcare as it stands, and we're now, once a vaccine comes out, or hopefully when a vaccine comes out, we're going to ask these communities to take a vaccine and say, trust us, this will make things better. What is the government's plan, and what is your plan as the minister in charge of this issue to make sure that these Indigenous communities feel that it is safe for them to either get treatment for COVID-19 or take a vaccine if that is something that comes up in the near future?
It's like that, Mackenzie, that's an excellent question. The challenges we're facing in keeping Indigenous communities safe and keeping people alive are not obstacles that you find in non-Indigenous communities. One specific instance is access to appropriate health care, and when it is provided, the well-founded fear of accessing it. Asking communities that have issues with overcrowding to isolate, and providing, yes, very sophisticated isolation structures to achieve the 3 pillars of stamping out COVID, which is testing, tracking, and isolation. But they're dealing with a set of cards that are of exceedingly poor quality compared to those that are dealt to non-Indigenous peoples. As we move forward, and to your point on vaccines, if and when there is an effective vaccine, its deployment in an ethical fashion, making sure that Indigenous peoples once again don't feel like guinea pigs. This is something that I've heard in a very raw fashion from Indigenous health experts, making sure that things are done in a culturally responsible fashion. One of the modest successes of the first wave of financing and support that we've given to Indigenous communities is to ensure that we respect their decision making. So funding with very few strings attached, nurses that have that cultural and sensitivity, things done in a way that communities are asking us to do. Those have proven results, and it's proven in the numbers. So you ask yourself, what kind of comfort do you give to someone who you're asking to get a vaccine? Well, there's sufficient proof in the uptake, or the lower rate of uptake in the seasonal flu vaccine to Indigenous communities which is much less than in non-Indigenous communities, that points you to not only a pattern of what could be, and we have our experience and the disastrous deployment of vaccines during H1N1, which are top of mind as we start to put together an ethical framework to helping those that are more vulnerable. Indigenous communities up to now in the first wave have done exceedingly well thanks to amazing leadership and deploying resources that are less than those in non-Indigenous communities. The second wave is of extreme concern to me, particularly because we still have lots to understand about COVID, but also because there's less room now for mistakes as we take a more surgical approach to risk management as opposed to risk elimination. As we get to a deployment of a vaccine, that'll mean real and deep engagement with the communication links that we've had up to now into communities and nursing stations and those who hold the health portfolio within the community. The most successful communities have really deployed and put front and center their health portfolio person, whether that's a doctor or just the person on council that manages health issues, and working with them and letting them decide. And obviously, option is Ottawa is in no position to impose things to Indigenous peoples and let that decision be theirs. But that means an exceedingly more intense amount of engagement and communication with communities as we ask them to trust us where we have failed them before. And that's a tall task for those involved in deploying an effective vaccine, which is intended to keep people safe.
I'll check if we have one question on the phone. Operator, do we have a question?
Yes, thank you. Our first question from Dylan Robertson, Winnipeg Press. Your line is open. À vous la parole.
Hi, Minister. Thanks for taking our questions here. You spoke earlier in the spring about the jurisdiction when it comes to containment measures. And I'm looking back now that we're in the second wave and we're seeing some outbreaks in Manitoba First Nations. I want to know who assesses whether there's adequate spaces to self-isolate or, to isolate people. And is it the nursing station that makes that call or is it the Chiefs and Council?
Well, thank you, Dylan. And, the first I want to give a shout out to the rapid response teams in Manitoba that are really first in class in being able to move quickly and deploy and put into operation the three pillars of ensuring we can stamp out COVID, that is tracking, tracing, and isolation. They have done an amazing job, and we are cautiously optimistic. There are two communities that we're speaking about, York Factory and Little Grand Rapids. Little Grand Rapids, we are still looking at it very, very carefully as the teams have deployed. We work with local community leadership and nursing stations. As I mentioned to Mackenzie, the most successful communities are those who have let science and their medical officers or that person holding the medical portfolio in the community be front and center in the decision making and taking the politics out of it. That's a tall task, and it is not possible all of the time. But what we know is that those communities that have done so and followed their decision-making process, whether it is that difficult decision to close a community, allocate space, work with the pandemic plan, work with First Nations Health and Inuit branch of Indigenous Services Canada, and make sure that their needs are articulated and actioned upon quickly. My job is to get stuff out as quickly as possible to the communities as they express that need. We do our best job to have the shortest turnaround time possible, and respecting local decision making. So, when I say that some communities have to take decisions that non-Indigenous communities don't have to take, there's two things that come to mind: isolating outside communities, having temporary structures that can aid in overcrowding. We can't fix overcrowding overnight in the situation of a pandemic, but we do have to take the measures necessary to properly isolate people, and particularly the elderly that we know are the most vulnerable. So who takes the decision? Obviously, the preference always is to follow the latest and greatest medical advice to the extent we know it. But there's always a process of dialogue and back and forth between chief and council, the nursing station, the medical health portfolio holder, and officials here at FNIB and in the region. And I would say that the model that is in Manitoba, as you probably know well, because that's an area that you cover a lot, is really doing an excellent job in managing and reacting and doing exactly what is needed to stomp in COVID. There's some excellent, despite the odds, there are some excellent success stories in Indigenous communities, whether we're speaking about one that occupied a lot of time in terms of our preoccupation with it in La Loche earlier in the spring or late spring, to to the ones that are really top of mind right now, which are the two you mentioned in York Factory and Little Grand Rapids.
Follow up, Dylan?
Thank you. And I was wondering what triggers military resources. I know that the Army is on standby if needed. In the spring, we did have some councils asking for a staging hospital that was declined. There was alternative measures that were found. So I'm just wondering, is there a protocol in place now in terms of, who sets the bar for getting the military involved and what that bar might be?
Typically, Dylan, it is a request for assistance from the province. And usually that has come quite quickly in terms of deployment of rangers and so forth. Again, in the spring, there were a lot of requests for things that perhaps were not following the latest and greatest of what was actually needed. The capacity of the armed forces is great, although it is not a provider of primary care. And that said, when you talk about a full-fledged military hospital, there needs to be a dialogue as to what works in the community at that point in time, and there are decisions that need to be made on the ground. And it's very difficult to speculate as to a specific set fact pattern, but what we do know is when those needs are articulated, we can fill them. Sometimes it's more important to evacuate someone to a hospital, depending on the capacity that is there. But the question I always ask is what does that mean specifically when you ask for a military hospital? Because that can mean different things to different people, frankly. And it's something that is only achieved through continuing that dialogue and having an open and honest dialogue as to what those needs are and how they are expressed and how we deploy resources. And we've said time and time again, whether it's the surge capacity resources that we've mobilized the communities in need, that we will not leave Indigenous communities behind, and that all options are on the table. Again, we have to have the nitty-gritty is really having a discussion about what exactly that means.
Operator, do we have another question on the phone?
Thank you. La prochaine question, our next question, Catherine Lévesque, La Presse canadienne. Your line is open.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Miller. Donc, il y a sur la mort de Joyce Echaquan, pardon. Il y a 3 enquêtes actuellement au Québec. Monsieur Legault, le premier ministre du Québec, s'est excusé il y a quelques moments, mais Monsieur Legault refuse toujours de prononcer les mots racisme systémique. Je me demandais, est-ce que c'est problématique à votre avis?
Ben, ultimement, ce sera au premier ministre de répondre pour ce qu'il pense de la situation. La réalité, c'est que le racisme systémique existe à travers le Canada. Ça existe au Québec dans le système de santé. Ça existe dans les forces de police. Ça existe dans la fonction publique à différents degrés. D'abord, ces excuses présentées à l'Assemblée nationale sont un très bon début. Pour moi, la reconnaissance que le système de santé du Québec a trahi la famille de Joyce. C'est une reconnaissance du racisme systémique et conséquemment, je salue cette reconnaissance. C'est un début. Écoutez, on a du travail à faire à travers le Canada. Ce qui continue de m'écœurer, c'est non seulement ces instances graves d'écart inacceptable de conduite, et oui, il faut congédier les personnes qui commettent ces actes racistes dans des circonstances où les gens sont dans une position des plus vulnérables. Écoutez, j'ai rencontré la famille avec la ministre Bennett jeudi soir, si je me souviens bien, et voilà M. Carole Dubé qui va devoir élever ses enfants seuls. Ça n'aurait jamais dû être le cas. Il y en a 7. C'est un drame qui ne va pas être réparé simplement avec des excuses, mais avec des actions. Le courage de M. Dubé et du conseil, des membres du conseil de bande qui étaient là, M. Guiniquan, était tel que oui, il voulait des réponses. Oui, il voulait de la justice pour Joyce, mais presque d'abord et avant tout, il voulait de la justice pour toutes les victimes de racisme à travers le Canada. Et et c'est très courageux, surtout dans un moment de deuil si profond pour cette famille. Il y a du travail à faire. C'est le travail, oui, du fédéral, oui, du provincial, oui, des territoires, de tous les Canadiens, des Québécois. Et on voit avec la réaction qui est viscérale à travers le pays à quel point ça dégoûte, ça écœure de voir ces écarts de conduite persistantes quand les gens sont des plus vulnérables. On le doit aux victimes, on le doit au chef Adams qui s'est vu interpellé par la police de façon si violente en fin de printemps. On le doit à toutes ces personnes qui sont victimes de racisme. Il faut reconnaître que le racisme systémique existe. C'est la raison pour laquelle les peuples autochtones, entre autres, n'ont pas accès adéquat à des centres, à des soins de santé et des services adéquats pour un pays qui est le meilleur au monde, mais aussi qu'ils y refusent d'y aller parce que, entre autres, ils ont peur de se faire traiter de tous les maux. Ils ont peur de se faire maltraiter. Il y a des preuves à l'appui. C'est écrit en noir et blanc dans la commission vient. Je parlais au chef Picard hier soir. C'est venu me fouetter le fait qu'ils me disent qu'il y a des gens quand même qui normalisent la situation. Ils trouvent ça normal, des Autochtones, puis ils voient ça, c'est parce qu'ils voient ça au jour le jour. Et c'est quelque chose qu'il faut continuer de conscientiser les gens, tous les Canadiens, sur le sujet, parce que ce n'est pas en niant le racisme systémique que le racisme systémique va disparaître.
Un court suivi, Catherine?
Oui, tout à fait. En même temps, il y a un malaise actuellement au Québec avec la notion de racisme systémique. Ce sont des mots que, comme je l'ai dit, que François Legault refuse de prononcer, que tout son gouvernement refuse de prononcer, que le Bloc québécois aussi refuse de prononcer. Donc, qu'est-ce que vous dites à ces gens qui disent que de dire qu'il y a du racisme systémique au Québec, c'est de faire le procès des Québécois?
Aucunement le cas. Les Québécois sont des gens chaleureux, ouverts, j'en suis un moi-même, qui ont été eux-mêmes victimes de racisme et victimes de racisme systémique. Je pense que tout le monde est mal à l'aise. Je pense que même vous, comme journaliste, vous êtes mal à l'aise en continuant de poser la question, tandis que ça saute aux yeux. Il y a des rapports après rapports qui disent très clairement, noir sur blanc, ce qui est l'état des choses. Et les résultats mesurables, tangibles, sont à l'appui. Je parlais tantôt à Mackenzie à propos du taux de vaccination contre la grippe saisonnière qui est moindre dans les communautés autochtones parce qu'ils ont un scepticisme légitime envers le système de santé. Et ça, c'est dans les cas où ces soins de santé sont disponibles. Il y a une question de disponibilité. Les écarts qui existent entre les peuples autochtones et non autochtones au Canada, ça inclut le Québec, et de 40 places, le Canada se situe à grosso modo dans l'indice de développement humain à la 10e place, disons, selon les dernières statistiques, puis les peuples autochtones en 50e place, et peuples autochtones sur réserve, ça frise la 70e place. Alors, il y a du travail à faire. Ce qui justifie cet écart, ce qui explique cet écart, c'est en grande partie la moitié par des facteurs qui sont liés à la santé. Donc, en reconnaissant le racisme systémique, on peut commencer à réparer les torts qui existent, qui persistent, et ce n'est pas en niant que le racisme systémique va disparaître.
We have time for one last question. No follow-up, and no?
Mr. Miller, I just want to change topics with you from the Indigenous file to your constituency as a Quebec MP. Obviously, today, Quebec had a terrible COVID day, the highest number of cases that they've reported ever. Are you happy with the changes that Premier Legault has brought in? And what things from a federal perspective do you think need to be done to help Quebec get out of the difficult situation that they're in?
Well, we've said time and time again, we're not going to leave any person behind in Canada. I'm glad that Quebec has adopted the COVID Act. It isn't a magic wand. It is a tool among many others to identify when to get tested. It is clear that in the last couple of months we've been increasing our testing capacity, and what we're seeing today reflects a bit of a trailing picture. So what you announced today as a measure for confinement obviously has to be adhered to, and that is us us Canadians letting down our vigilance is a real challenge because COVID spreads through contact. I'm worried because it is principally, it has been principally among a group, a younger group of people. Our testing is perhaps getting a little more sophisticated in terms of who we're capturing, but it is very alarming to see these numbers move from day to day. I think if Canadians band together and do what we do best, we can certainly get out of this, but it takes action now. Otherwise, we start counting in numbers of days until these numbers start to double. And the pressure on the healthcare system is certainly of great concern, particularly in the Montreal area and environments where this is spreading quite rapidly. So yes, I'm worried. And in my own portfolio, I'm exceedingly worried about the impact of the second wave on Indigenous communities, which is, while they've done exceedingly well in the first wave, every case of COVID has the potential to spread like wildfire in Indigenous communities and takes a massive deployment effort within the community of resources and time, and the risk of getting out of control. And I think that worries me, principally in my portfolio, but as an MP for downtown Montreal, where we've seen some of the worst spreads, where we had members of the armed forces go in and take care of long-term health facilities. I don't think Canadians will have patience for any mistakes. We have to have learned from what we've done, and moving forward, the tolerance for mistakes will be much, much less. And so I think while we move to this new normal, I think that we need to realize that this may not be a linear process, and more strict measures may have to be put into place. And that scares me because there are effects of that, on mental health, on the economy. But if people keep doing what we're asking them to do, and continue to observe basic hygiene protocols that have worked in other pandemics, washing your hands, wearing a mask in public, social distancing, isolating when you feel symptoms, we'll get through this, and I'm very confident on that end.
Thank you.